Episode 1, Where the Pages Bled. It began with a whisper, not in the chapel, not from the child, but from the book, the one she had buried. Mara hadn't touched it in 6 weeks. Not since the night the altar opened. Not since she gave birth to something the world refused to name. Not since the candlelight burned backwards and every cross in the chapel bowed. But now, in the deepest hour of night, the book was open again. She didn't open it. It opened itself. The pages fluttered like wings, and then stopped. On a page that hadn't been there before. There was no ink, no handwriting, just a shape, a fingerprint, pressed in dried blood. Hers. And beneath it, etched so faintly it could have been breath. Write, or be written. She reached for it. Her fingers hesitated in the air, then landed, soft, trembling. The moment she touched the page, her skin split, not painfully, almost respectfully. A thin bead of blood ran down her finger, curved across the paper, and formed words she didn't know she remembered. Not Latin, not Hebrew, but something older, a tongue without vowels, a language that had only ever been spoken by bones. She read aloud. We are the verses buried in silence. We are the psalms that bled before they were named. We are the uncanonized. Her voice deepened as she read. The shadows in the room leaned in, and from the cradle behind her, the child stirred, but did not cry. He never cried. He only listened, and sometimes, when she dared to watch, he smiled. Suddenly, the book snapped shut, not with violence, with finality. On its cover now, a new word carved in her own blood, unsainted. She tried to move, but the room pulsed once, like a heart remembering how to beat. And then, from the walls, the names came, whispers first, then louder, then screaming. Let us speak. Let us be written. Let us be remembered. The mirror cracked. The candles flickered black. And across the wooden floor, slowly forming in blood trailing from her own feet, 5 names, 5 women, 5 chapters yet to come. Mara fell to her knees. The book opened again, this time blank, but waiting. She didn't question it anymore. She took the pen, dipped it in her own blood, and began to write what had been waiting centuries to be spoken. Book of the Unsainted, Chapter 1. She did not kneel to pray. She knelt to remember. And somewhere in the house, the child began to hum. A song no one had taught him. A song older than forgiveness. Episode 2. The first voice she didn't recognize. The pen moved before she did. At first, Mara thought it was exhaustion. Too many nights without sleep. Too many whispers clinging to the corners of her mind. But no, this time, the pen moved before her hand even decided to follow. It traced the first letter on the blank page. An unfamiliar curve. A hook where there should have been a line. A slash that felt more like a wound than a word. And then, faster than thought, the writing poured out. Words, sentences, an entire language bleeding from her fingertips. But none of them were hers. Her breath caught in her chest. She tried to stop, tried to lift her hand. It wouldn't move. The blood in her veins felt thicker now, heavier, as if it had to remember the way down the bone to reach the page. The candlelight around her warped. Shadows leaned closer, and in the distance, the child in the cradle laughed, soft, almost proud. When Mara finally tore her hand free, the page was full, covered in looping, furious script that looked more carved than written. She leaned in, heart pounding, and tried to read, but the words shifted, flickered, refused her, until she whispered aloud the last name the confessional had gifted her, a Samuel. The letters stilled, the words solidified, and the first sentence seared itself into her mind like a brand. I am the one who heard the first confession and wept before heaven learned shame. Her mouth opened, not by choice, by necessity, and a voice, deep guttural, ancient, spoke through her lips. You call me when you remembered. You birthed what they buried. Now you must speak what they tried to silence. Mara clutched the table. The world tilted, not spinning, slipping. as if reality itself had grown too thin to hold her weight. She blinked, and in the corner of the room, she saw a reflection. But it wasn't her. It was a woman in bloodied white robes, her mouth stitched shut, her eyes burning gold, and around her neck hung a rosary made not of beads, but of human teeth. The woman raised one finger to her lips, and the stitches split open, releasing a cloud of whispers. If you survive the first voice, you will not survive the second. Mara stumbled back. The pen dropped from her hand. The book snapped shut on its own, almost protecting her. But in the silence that followed, 3 new words burned themselves into cover. Deeper than blood, deeper than bone. Speak, or disappear. She gasped for breath. The child's laughter turned into a song, and the cracked walls around her began to hum in rhythm, like a congregation ready for a sermon that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Outside, the first cracks appeared in the sky, tiny fractures, like the surface of an old mirror. And somewhere beyond the clouds, a choir sang with voices that had been gagged for 1,000 years, waiting for Mara to finish what they had died to begin. Episode 3. The blood that didn't dry. The blood should have dried. It should have crusted over, flaked away, left nothing but faint scars on the pages she had filled in a frenzy the night before. But when Mara woke, it was still wet. She sat up slowly. The book lay open beside her on the cracked chapel floor. The crimson words shimmered under the morning light, leaking through the broken windows, pulsing faintly, as if the blood still remembered the rhythm of her heart. When she touched the page, the blood rippled under her fingertips, not dripping, not smearing, moving, following the lines she had written, breathing through each letter like veins too stubborn to die. Her stomach twisted. This was not just her blood anymore. It had become theirs. Each letter a syllable borrowed from a voice that had once been buried under ash and forgotten psalms. Each curve a bone rising through sacred soil. Each word a name whispered by women whose prayers had been burned before they ever reached heaven. A sudden gust of wind slammed the chapel door open. Dust stormed the aisle, and Mara heard it, soft but undeniable. The pages were whispering. She pressed her ear closer. The voices were layered, tangled like roots, sobs, laughter, prayers, curses, and beneath them all one clear, resonant sentence. We are not stories. We are survivors. The air grew thick, heavy with memory. The walls seemed to bend inward, like they, too, were listening. Mara clutched the book tighter. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. A drop of fresh blood slid down from the corner of the page. It traced a single word onto the floor. Testify. The room darkened. The candles relit themselves. But the flames burned blue, cold, unnatural. And in that strange light, Mara saw the pages she had written were changing. New words stitched themselves between her original lines, not in English, not even in Latin, but in a language that spoke directly to her bones. She could understand it without translation, and the meaning carved itself into her mind like fire across an ancient tapestry. Every prayer forgotten, every woman silenced, every womb used and discarded. We remember, and we refuse to be erased. Mara's vision blurred. The book vibrated in her hands, and then the blood lifted, rose from the pages, forming shapes in the air, figures, women, veiled, scarred, glowing. They circled her, chanting without sound, eyes locked on her body, her heart, her soul. And in one unified voice, without moving their mouths, they spoke. Write until the blood remembers its owner. Write until the sky bleeds back what it stole. Write until the unsainted sing through your bones. The figures dissolved. The chapel returned to silence. The book closed itself with a sigh of exhausted breath. And on its spine, newly carved by invisible hands. This is not possession. This is inheritance. Mara fell to her knees. Her hands shook. Her mouth formed a prayer she had never learned but had always known. I will bleed. I will write. I will remember what they forced me to forget. Outside, the first drops of rain fell, but they weren't clear. They were red, and when they touched the earth began to sing. Episode 4. The names that refused to fade. The first name she wrote wasn't hers. It arrived in the middle of the night, scrawled across her mirror in condensation, as if the room itself had been breathing her memory back to her. Anika, simple, unfamiliar, but the moment she whispered it aloud, the room exhaled, and somewhere in the world, a grave cracked open. Mara didn't know what had happened. Not at first. All she knew was that when she touched the book again, it was no longer blank. The next chapter had already begun writing itself. Not in ink, not even in blood, but in ashes. Fine, gray strokes formed a sentence along the margin. She died with her name sewn shut. The page pulsed with sorrow. The ash quivered, and then another line appeared. Give it back. So Mara wrote. She didn't plan it, didn't draft or think. She remembered, and as the words poured from her hand, they no longer felt like fiction. They felt like a resurrection, slow and quiet, painful in its stillness. A girl, buried beneath a convent floor, nails painted crimson, forbidden vanity, mouth stuffed with pages from her own diary. Her final prayer, let someone remember me right. Mara's hands trembled. The words wouldn't stop. By the time the chapter ended, the candlelight had turned black, and her mirror reflected two shadows instead of one. That same night, a priest in northern Italy was found dead, his church desecrated, his hands clutching an old parish record, open to a page with one name erased, Anika, and beneath it, newly burned into the paper. I remember now. Back in the chapel, Mara stared at the book. It pulsed like flesh. She flipped back through the chapters and saw them, names. She hadn't written them consciously, but there they were, each name a scar, each page a tombstone. She counted 12. 12 women, 12 unsainted. And now with Anika, 13. She tried to close the book. It wouldn't shut. The air grew heavy, and in the stone beneath her knees, names began to etch themselves from beneath. Not carved in, but pushing upward, as if long-buried bones were reaching for a voice. Mara backed away. The chapel walls moaned. Candles burst into white flame. The book flipped open on its own. A map unfolded across the pages. Not geography, not roads, but graves, unmarked, scattered across continents. And next to each one, a name just starting to form, unfinished, waiting for blood to finish the ink. The book whispered, every forgotten name is a closed mouth. You are the opening. Mara collapsed, and behind her, the child stirred in his sleep, not crying, chanting. Whispers poured from his tiny lips, each one a name, each one a story that hadn't been told. And outside the chapel, for the first time in a century, the cemetery gates blew open on their own. Episode 5. The Sermon of the Unspoken. She didn't walk into the church. She was led, not by hands, not by voice, but by sound. Faint, off-key, impossible. A single organ note vibrating through the air like a frequency from beneath the earth. Not music, not him, a summoning. The church stood at the edge of a dying town. Its steeple snapped in half like a broken finger pointing nowhere. Every window was black, every door sealed, except one. It opened for her, not as welcome, but as command. She stepped inside, and silence greeted her like a congregation that never left. The pews were full, not with bodies, with shapes, veiled, shadowed, unmoving. Each figure sat upright, hands folded neatly in their laps, but no breath steamed from their lips. No skin glowed on the thin light, only robes, only presence. And at the front of the chapel, the pulpit stood bare, until it didn't. She blinked, and someone was there, tall, featureless, a preacher dressed in rotting vestments, face wrapped in gauze. From behind the cloth, a voice pushed through, like smoke through water. We are gathered not to be saved, but to remember what salvation costs. The organ played itself. One low note, then two, then a ripple of chords older than melody. And Mara felt her knees buckle. The floor was too alive, the walls too listening. Her name, echoing from mouths that hadn't spoken in centuries. Scribe, scribe, scribe. She wanted to leave. Her feet refused, because she knew the sermon wasn't for her ears. It was for her blood. And the preacher spoke again. Before forgiveness was written, there was a version of grace no man could control. It spoke through wombs. It burned through tongues. It remembered what heaven silenced. The veiled figures nodded in unison. Their hands lifted. Pages began to rise from their laps, ancient, brittle, glowing faintly, each one covered in handwriting. But no ink, only ash. And the preacher called out, "Who will read the verse that burned? Who will remember what was torn out of the gospel?" The congregation turned to her. Mara shook her head. "No, I don't know it." But the book in her arms opened anyway, and her voice, raw and unfamiliar, began to read aloud. She was not Eve. She was not Mary. She was a space between their names, and they tried to erase her with silence. The veiled figures wept, not from eyes, from their hands. Tears of ash spilled from their palms like long-forgotten scripture, and on the altar, something began to rise, not an idol, not a cross, but a mirror, and in it, Mara saw herself preaching, her mouth open wide, but the voice wasn't hers. It was all of theirs. Then the organ stopped. The preacher raised one finger, and the final line of the sermon thundered from nowhere and everywhere. The unsainted do not need redemption. They need remembrance. The candles blew out. The mirror shattered. And every name Mara had written that week burned across the walls in red flame, one by one, until only one remained. One she hadn't written yet. Her own, when she stepped out of the church. The bell tower rang once, with no bell inside, and the sound etched itself into sky like a crack. Chapter 6 will begin when you are no longer afraid to write yourself. Episode 6, The Ink That Remembered Her Face. It began with the ink, thicker than before, darker, still warm long after it left the pen. It clung to her skin like a second pulse, and when she tried to wipe it away, it didn't smear. It sank in. Mara watched as the letters she'd written the night before bled backward across the page, reversing themselves, undoing what she thought was finished, rewriting what she thought she had heard. And when the words stopped shifting, the new sentence stared back at her like an accusation. "You did not write me. You released me." She stumbled to the mirror. Her reflection blinked, half a second out of sync. She leaned closer. Her eyes were her own, but the expression behind them wasn't. There was a woman watching her through her, mouth pressed in, gaze hollow but insistent. And then, without moving her lips, Mara heard the voice. "You remember my name. Let me remember my face." The next time she slept, it wasn't alone. She dreamed of narrow hallways lined with mirrors, each one cracked differently, none reflecting her body. She ran past them, barefoot, heart racing, until one mirror held her still, but her face was no longer hers. It was younger, paler, crying, a girl she didn't recognize, but whose name she had written 2 chapters ago. Seraphine, the first to be buried beneath a convent for bleeding too soon, the first to scream scripture from her sleep. Now she smiled. "I never finished my life," she whispered, "so I will finish it in yours." Mara woke gasping. Her hands were covered in ink, her nails painted red, but she hadn't done that. And on the wall above her bed, written in her own handwriting, "Let me wear you, just for one day." She stumbled to the sink, washed her face, but her reflection didn't match. The woman in the mirror tilted her head when she didn't, and smiled, soft, grateful, knowing that day strangers looked at her differently. The man at the market nodded, as if he knew her. A child tugged at her coat and whispered, "You came back." Someone left flowers outside her door. No note, just petals shaped like crosses. She tried to write it off, but when she picked up the pen that night, her hand moved without her. It signed a name at the bottom of the page, Seraphine Marie Caro, and then the voice, now louder, deeper inside her throat. "I was never trying to possess you. I was just trying to be remembered in skin. Mara dropped the pen. The book closed, but her hands kept moving, brushing hair behind her ear in a way she never did, tilting her head in a rhythm that wasn't hers. And when she looked again at the mirror, the woman was closer, not inside, behind, and she whispered, "Let me finish my breath. Let me feel the sun. One day, then I'll leave. I swear." Mara touched her face. It felt the same, but her voice, when she spoke, was not alone anymore. Two tones, two timbres, one body, and in the shadows of the chapel, the other unsainted began to stir, because one of them had crossed the veil. And now, the skin remembered. Episode 7, the day the veil looked back. They sent a priest, not to bless her, not to guide her, but to verify her, to see if what was whispered in Rome was true, that a girl had opened a book that bled, that her hands no longer wrote fiction, but aftermath, that the unsainted were rising again. His name was Father Lucian. Oh, precise, dressed in black, so pure it swallowed the light. He carried no Bible, only silence. When he entered the chapel, the candles dimmed, the book shivered, and Mara smiled. But it wasn't her smile, not entirely. "You are the one they call Mara," he said. "I was," she answered. Her voice echoed wrong, too deep, too slow, like it remembered other tongues before this one. Lucian narrowed his eyes. "I came for the truth." "Then why did you bring fear with you?" she asked. He stepped closer. The book sat open behind her. Pages fluttered like wind had breath. He looked into her eyes, and for the briefest moment, he saw someone else, not behind her, not possessing her, layered beneath her, a face he'd only seen once in a forbidden archive. Seraphine, burned for blasphemy, buried under stone, declared a danger to God himself. And now, she blinked through Mara's face. Lucian stepped back. "You are not her." "No," Mara said softly, "but I remember her better than heaven ever tried to." The ground trembled. The altar cracked at its base. And from the book, a single line burned red across the open page. She was not erased. She was misplaced. Father Lucian turned toward the book. His hands shook. He had studied the heretics, memorized the doctrine, sworn never to speak of the women who were silenced to protect the myth of male sainthood. And now, he was looking into the eyes of one, alive again, or something close enough. He dropped to one knee, not in worship, in collapse, and whispered, "Were you?" Mara stepped forward, but the voice that answered him was not hers. It came from within her chest, from the pages, from the chapel walls. It said, "I am not a what? I am who you left behind, and I remember your handwriting on my sentence." Lucian wept. Mara knelt beside him. Her hand touched his shoulder, warm, steady, and she whispered, "You may leave now, but you will not leave unchanged." He nodded, and as he walked away, he didn't take his Bible. He took only one thing, her face, branded into his memory. The veil had looked back, and it saw him. That night, he sent a single message back to the Vatican. The unsainted are no longer waiting. One has already crossed the veil. The others are learning to walk. And below it, in trembling script, forgiveness is no longer ours to offer. Episode 8, The Choir with No Mouths. The first note came at dusk, soft, barely a vibration in the air. Not heard, felt like the moment before a scream, like a memory waking the lungs. Mara froze. The cradle fell silent. The book stopped fluttering, and the walls leaned inward to listen. She followed the sound, through the broken fields, past the shrines wrapped in barbed wire and rosaries, toward the chapel that had no doors, only holes where prayers used to go in and nothing ever came out. It was called El Coro Roto, the broken choir. Locals said no one lived there, but the candles never went out, and every dusk, the wind carried a melody no one could trace. Mara didn't knock. She entered like someone returning, and the music, if it could still be called that, welcomed her. Inside, it was dark, not from the lack of light, but from the weight of silence that had forgotten how to break. She stepped down the nave. Pews lined both sides. Full, every seat occupied. But no one moved. No heads turned. No eyes blinked. Only bodies, cloaked in ash-colored robes, faces tilted up, mouths sewn shut. And still, they were singing, not from their throats, from something deeper, their scars, their memory, their will. Mara felt it enter her chest like smoke, a hymn with no lyrics, a grief too vast for syllables, and yet she understood every note. The book in her hand grew heavy. Pages peeled themselves open, and new words formed on the parchment without her writing. This is the sound they could not kill. This is the breath that survived without breath. The choir swayed, in unison, not alive, not dead, just insisting. And in their movement, dust rose. Shapes formed in it. Letters. A name. Celine, one of the first. She who sang scripture backwards until her throat bled. She who was buried with a rosary nailed into her tongue. Mara stepped forward. The book trembled. And then, one of the choir members turned. Not her body, just her head. And even with no mouth, she smiled. The music swelled. And Mara suddenly felt the tears fall, not from emotion, but from recognition. This was not a choir. It was a resurrection disguised as harmony. And Celine was no longer content to be remembered. She wanted to sing again. The hymn shifted. Lower now, deeper, it pressed against Mara's bones. Her jaw tensed. Her lips moved, and she began to hum, not from memory, from inheritance, from a part of her soul that had been waiting centuries to awaken. The choir stopped, all at once, and stared, silent, listening. Then, slowly they bowed, not to her, to what had come through her. And the book wrote its own benediction across the final line of the page. When the mouth is taken, the soul will sing. And when the soul is heard, the veil will tear. Mara left El Coro Roto before sunrise. Behind her, the singing resumed, but this time, she could hear it from within, and her voice, once quiet, was no longer alone. Episode 9, The Cross That Turned Its Face. It didn't fall. It turned. That's what chilled Mara the most. The cross didn't shatter, didn't drop, didn't cry out like it had in other churches. It simply turned. Quiet, slow, deliberate, as if it had finally heard what she was writing, and couldn't face the altar anymore. She had been praying, not to God, not to Samuel, not to the child in the cradle, just praying, out of habit, out of memory. And maybe that was enough to offend it, because as she whispered words she no longer believed, the wooden crucifix above the pulpit began to creak, not in protest, in shame, and turned, away from heaven, away from the book, toward her. She didn't scream. She looked back, and in that moment, Mara understood. The cross wasn't rejecting her. It was asking a question. A silent, devastating question written not in words, but in wood, weight, and centuries of contradiction. What are you doing to me? She stood beneath it, felt its gaze, felt every sermon, every confession, every sacrifice pinned to its beams tremble, as if the memory of what it had held could no longer bear the memory of what it now watched. The book flipped open beside her. The pages shook. Blood rose in the margins. And a new passage wrote itself, scrawled in frantic strokes. When the cross forgets what it died for, it looks for a new gospel to hang from. Mara stepped forward. The air cracked, and the crucifix, its head twisted, its eyes carved open, began to weep. Not water, resin, ash, oil, a mix of sacred and the spoiled. It dripped slowly onto the altar, and the flame in every candle turned black. In the silence that followed, she whispered, "You don't have to face me." But the cross didn't turn back. It stared. It stayed. And beneath her breath, something inside her said, "Because you are no longer the one being saved. You are the one being remembered." That night, Mara dreamed of churches with no altars, just circles of blood on the floor, just names written in languages too heavy for air. She saw a priest kneeling before women made of fire. She saw Bibles rewritten by children born without tongues. She saw the cross, buried in salt, weeping silently in a grave with no body. And above it all, the book, open, still writing. When she woke, the crucifix had not moved. It still faced her, and carved into the wall behind it, now burned deep from holy fire. If the sun turns his back, perhaps it was never the Father who was watching. Episode 10. The dust that refused to settle. It looked like nothing, just ash, coating the earth in a soft gray hush, blurring the bones of what used to be a chapel, smothering the altar that once held whispers too old for language. But Mara knew better. This was not ruin. This was remains. They had told her not to come. The map in the book marked the spot only with a word. Scattered. No name. No coordinates. Just grief pressed into dirt. And when she stepped onto that ground, the dust rose. Not from her steps. Not from wind. From memory. It curled around her ankles, delicate as breath. It wrapped her fingers, traced her wrists. And when she knelt and touched the earth, the ash trembled. A ripple spread out from her palm, like a wave of recognition. And suddenly, the world around her inhaled. The sky went silent. The wind stopped, and the dust began to sing. Not with sound, with shape. Tiny columns rising in the air. Silhouettes of people long burned, formed from nothing but particles of what they had once believed in. A pew here, a choir stand there, a pulpit made of bone dust and old breath. And in the center, a figure began to build itself. Woman, veiled, eyes closed, her mouth open not to speak, but to release. From her throat poured words that had never found paper, that no priest had dared record, that no fire had fully silenced. And the book, still clutched in Mara's hands, began to shake. New pages appeared, not written, grown, thin, translucent sheets of ash curling from the spine like petals, each one covered in script that shimmered only when touched by the dust around her. Mara traced the first line. It burned into her fingers. What was burned was not broken. It was simply scattered. And scattered things remember where they began. The ash woman lifted her head. Her eyes opened. They were empty, yet deeper than anything Mara had ever seen. And from within them, a voice spoke into her marrow. You are not just our writer. You are our reassembly. Then she crumbled, softly, not in death, but in return, and every particle flew into wind, not to disappear, but to find the others. Mara stood. The book glowed in her hands. The earth no longer felt heavy, and behind her, she heard the faint sound of wings made of soot, lifting something wholly back into the sky, one grain at a time, and the dust whispered, "We never stop being. We only stop being seen." Episode 11. The tongue that never rotted. They found it beneath the ashes. Not bone, not relic, not a symbol twisted by time. Just a tongue, small, pink, preserved, alive. It pulsed faintly when the wind touched it, refused to blacken, refused to dry, refused to rot, as if the earth itself had made a covenant. This part shall not be silenced. Mara didn't believe it at first. She thought it was illusion, hallucination, another echo of a memory trying too hard to matter. But when she reached for it, it turned toward her, not the tongue, the book. It opened like a jaw unhinging. Pages flipped, blood whispered, and on the inside cover, where no ink had ever touched, 3 words appeared. Don't speak. Listen. So she did. She knelt in the dirt, pressed both palms into the ash, let the tongue lie there between them, and the world around her grew impossibly still. Then, from the tiny flesh, a voice, no breath, no throat, no lungs, just language, ancient, tremoring, raw. It didn't speak into the air. It entered her skin, like every syllable was a key turning inside her ribs. She saw fire, chains, a girl no older than 15, screaming scripture backward until her body convulsed. They said she was possessed. But it wasn't a demon that lived inside her. It was a psalm with no place left to go. They ripped out her tongue so she'd stop. They burned her body to cleanse it, but her voice remained. And now it was inside Mara, whispering, pleading, finishing. The book pulsed. Words spilled across the page as if vomited by the wind itself. The tongue remembers the truth, even when the body is forced to forget. Mara's jaw locked. Her lips trembled. And then, for the first time in her life, she spoke a language she had never learned, but that her bones understood. The words bent the light, bent the trees, bent the silence around her like reality had forgotten its shape. And when she stopped, she wept, not from fear, but from release. Because now, the girl in the vision had a name, Callista, and Callista was not a ghost. She was a stanza waiting to be sung again. Mara wrapped the tongue in linen, laid it gently into the spine of the book, and it fused quietly, like it had always been meant to return. And the book, grateful, whispered across its last page of the night. She was not condemned for lying. She was condemned for speaking too early. Episode 12, the book that wrote itself. She didn't open it. It opened her. For weeks, Mara had written with hands not entirely hers. Words that tasted like soot, names that bled into paper, pages that beat like hearts when the wind passed through. But this time, she didn't move. The book did. It waited until just before dawn, when the world was weakest, when the sky forgot its color, when even the birds were too afraid to speak. Then, the cover creaked, the spine stretched, and a new chapter began. Without her, no ink, no pen, just page after page after page, filling itself with words scraped from dreams, with names etched from gravestones, with prayers that had never been finished. And with every line, Mara felt her ribs open, like the story had to move through her to make itself real. The walls around her cracked, not from weight, from truth, as if the very stones could no longer pretend not to know what she knew, that this book was no longer a book. It was a being, living, remembering, demanding, and somewhere deep inside its parchment lungs, it had begun to breathe. Across the floor, blood slithered. Thin rivers, winding toward the altar. Mara didn't see a wound. She didn't feel pain. But something in the chapel had bled itself into offering. Not animal, not sacrifice. Names, blood-spelled names. Dozens, hundreds. People she had never met. People who had died before the world learned how to bury guilt properly. And beneath every name, the same phrase appeared in red. I died forgotten, but now I am part of the gospel. The book shook. It began to hum. A low, ancient sound like paper chanting. Then it lifted, floated, hung open in the air, pages spinning faster than the eye could track, and in a voice made of thousands of mouths whispering through parchment. I do not need a writer. I need a witness. Mara dropped to her knees, not in worship, in awe, in exhaustion, in surrender. The book slammed shut, and the air went still, but not quiet, because now the whole chapel was breathing, and carved into the stone beneath her, glowing faintly like hot ash. The unsainted no longer need to speak. The world itself will speak for them now. Later that night, when she returned to the cradle, the child was gone, not taken, sent, and in his place, a single page, fresh, warm, written in her own handwriting, though she never touched a pen. I was the voice. Now I am the silence that sings. Let the next one bleed. The final shot of the season. Mara standing alone in the empty chapel, surrounded by walls that now whisper, a book that no longer waits, and a sky cracked wide open above her, as if heaven itself is remembering what it chose to forget.